Hi there, this is Susanna Gabrielli.
And this is Cleo Constantine.
And you're listening to The Candid Companion. This is the second installment of a two-part series that we're doing regarding the decriminalization of sex work.
Last week we spoke about how the great majority of sex workers are currently pushing for decriminalization. However, we are of the opinion that decriminalization is only the first step rather than the final destination of securing rights, freedoms, and protection for sex workers.
We came to this conclusion largely based on our time in New South Wales and New Zealand earlier this year. We were touring the Southern Hemisphere. In both these places, sex work is currently decriminalized. We were working in brothels there kind of to gain experience and also to see what the situation was like under decriminalization. And the fact remains that there's still a lot of work to be done.
The problem with decriminalization as it functions is that it's limited in its scope because of societal stigma and discrimination.
During this episode, we'd like to share with you an interview that we had with Cameron Cox, who is the CEO of SWOP in New South Wales, which is a grassroots organization, stands for the Sex Worker Outreach Project. He talked about how sex work came to be decriminalized in New South Wales, a little bit about his organization. Decriminalization, the New South Wales was actually the first place in the world to adopt the model of decriminalization. So he tells a little bit about how that happened.
So can you tell us a bit about the background of your organization?
Yeah, sure. The organisation was formed about 30 years ago. It was called the Australian Prostitutes Collective.
Mm-hmm.
And it was formed when most of the work was street-based work around the Darlinghurst and King's Cross area, brothels as well, but mainly street-based work. And it was formed by street-based sex workers who had a political agenda to decriminalise sex work in New South Wales.
Mm. Okay. And can you tell us a bit about the background of how decriminalisation came to pass in New South Wales?
Yes, I can. About 10 years before brothels were actually decriminalised, there'd been a number of inquiries into, inverted commas, prostitution. And there was one called the Rogan Report, and the gentlemen who wrote that report were parliamentarians, and it was written into the report that they weren't to recommend anything positive about sex work, that it was to be a restrictive report, and they basically, new frameworks for criminalisation. These guys took themselves around the world looking at sex work in different countries around the world.
It was like a think tank?
Like a think tank,
yeah.
And remarkably, they came back and they wrote a submission, a report in favour of decriminalisation, even though they hadn't seen a decriminalised situation because there wasn't one.
Mm-hmm.
They were also very influenced by New South Wales sex workers who had organised through the Prostitutes Collective and in other places, and actually came and gave evidence in front of the inquiry, face-to-face with parliamentarians. So the parliamentarians started to realise that we were actual people. We weren't monsters. We weren't, the Hollywood version of us, that we were actual people with actual work and actual problems, etc., etc. And they wrote a report favouring decriminalisation.
And what time was this in time?
This is about maybe 35 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's 10 years before decriminalisation came along.
Mm-hmm.
Then that report sat on the shelf for 10 years, gathering dust, as a lot of those sort of reports do. until there was another government inquiry. The government's always having inquiries, and this one was into police corruption. Now, there was a lot of police corruption in New South Wales, and always had been, but every couple of years when they had an inquiry into police corruption, the commissioner who headed the inquiry didn't see any corruption at all and came up with a report that said, oh yes, there's a few bad apples, but on the whole, everything's fine, which everybody in New South Wales knew that it wasn't. So this commissioner was James Wood. He was a retired judge, and they always pick somebody that they think is going to bring in the right result. James Wood decided he'd actually expose all the corruption, and without telling anybody, he formed an undercover squad of people to go around and collect evidence. And they collected a massive amount of evidence about police corruption. Some of it was to do with the sex industry, because police could walk into a brothel at any stage then with a piece of paper and declare the brothel what was called a disorderly house and close it. So just off their own bat, they could say, you're a brothel, you're a disorderly house, you're closed. And they used that law to go around extorting money out of brothels, or brothel owners. And eventually a lot of police became brothel owners. And that wasn't a particularly good situation.
At that time, was it criminal to run a brothel?
Yes.
Yeah. So it was not even in any way legal to run a brothel at that time?
No.
Right. So it was a criminal activity?
Brothels were a criminal activity. Yeah. Okay, so then you have the police being the main criminals. But of course, for brothel workers, that was a pretty shitty sort of situation. Because if anything happened in your brothel, you had no one to go to, and especially not the police, because the police were the guys going, no, get back in the room and do it, And you'd have to do clients for free. People who weren't working for the police had to pay the police off. People like me who were working on the street could end up with broken ribs, which I did, being kicked in the notorious 4th Street police station, where they took people and bashed them, which is where they took the 78ers from Mardi Gras and bashed them all. Okay. And so it was pretty good to get rid of that situation. But that was the catalyst, this massive police corruption that went through a lot of industries, including the sex industry, prompted the decriminalisation of sex work here in New South Wales. And almost overnight, the corruption and the police or whatever melted away, and they were no longer in the industry. You'll be told that the number of brothels exploded, and exploded's a great word, they're always saying that about the sex industry. And the number of brothels did increase fairly dramatically, but the number of sex workers didn't, because what happened is the big police-controlled brothels, the workers just split and started to open 2, 3, 4-person premises.
Right.
Okay, so lots of little places, cottage industry, the way I think it should be mainly.
More like a collective? Almost?
Collective, yeah.
And what happened to the police when the decriminalisation came in? All these police that were...
A lot of them retired on stress leave and sick leave and had to go look after their families and decided on other career options. A few went to court and ended up in jail.
Right.
Including, I think, the Chief Magistrate. And New South Wales was literally corrupt from the Premier down. Yeah, it was not a good situation.
And when did decriminalisation come in New South Wales?
About 25, 26 years ago.
Wow.
And really like a result of the police corruption.
It was triggered by the police corruption. The beautiful Rogan report, which they used that as sort of we've got this and it says we should do this, but they were really getting themselves out of the embarrassment of having a corrupt police force. And it was really good for sex workers. There'd been other small decriminalisations before then. At one stage, street-based work was decriminalised, but the inner city was becoming gentrified, and that didn't go down too well with the people moving into their lovely little terrace houses that they were going to renovate. And of course, they do the inspections at 11 o'clock in the morning, the auctions at 12. Nobody ever goes there at 11 o'clock at night and finds there are 3 or 4 street-based workers working outside who quite rightly, I think they own that footpath because their mother and their grandmother probably worked there before them. And then there were, of course, territory disputes because people discovered they brought in a red light area and they wanted the sex workers out. And
is street-based work now criminalised in New South Wales?
That's the next point I think we should make, is that we're not fully decriminalised in New South Wales. There are still 3 or 4 or 5 laws hanging over from the past that weren't removed in the decriminalisation. And so we're actually not fully decriminalised.
And what are some of those laws that remain?
They're around street-based work and a couple of other issues. So, not a perfect system as far as not perfect or pure decriminalisation, even though people assume that it is because it's always called Decrim, and they go, New Zealand and New South Wales, and New Zealand's system isn't perfect and it's not full decriminalisation either. For example, you can't be a migrant sex worker. And there's regulations placed on brothels, which some people see as being good and some people see as being bad, but it's definitely not.
Yeah, like mandatory condom use and that sort of thing, which is, can on the surface seem like an obvious law, but it actually isn't always in practice.
It's not always in practice.
Yeah.
In Queensland, it's led to sex workers being entrapped and police ringing and using sex workers very much as soft targets as well. And quite often on the phone you'll talk fantasy or whatever and give a little bit of a different picture of what's going to occur than what actually occurs when the client arrives, because you want the client to arrive.
Yeah.
But if you're in Queensland and you do that, when they arrive, they'll actually have a warrant for your arrest with you, and that's not been a good thing. And we know here we've got better sexual health in our sex workers than in Queensland, and we think that's one of the reasons, because we have those choices. But that is a difficult question. Sex workers have different opinions on it.
So do you think overall decriminalisation has been advantageous to sex workers in New South Wales?
I think it's been advantageous. It's a much better system than the criminalised system that we worked under before, but it's not working perfectly and it has problems. Okay, the idea of the government, and the government got all very pure and high and mighty when they decriminalised, was that we'd be treated like any other industry. Unfortunately, due to prejudice and stigma and discrimination, that doesn't happen. For example, councils were to allocate land use for brothels just on the same way as they did for news agencies and barber shops and whatever. But news agencies aren't forced to locate in industrial areas, as brothels are in many councils. Many councils do anything they can to prevent brothels. They have anti-clustering laws. There was the municipality of North Sydney, which has now, I think, been amalgamated, but at one stage it was about half a kilometre wide and a kilometre and a half long, because it's the CBD of North Sydney. So it's fairly small. And they put in an anti-clustering law that said something like you can't have one brothel within half a kilometre of another. Well, that gives them 2 brothels, in a very densely populated area. And then they started to complain because people were opening up massage parlours, which were possibly, where unpaid sexual activity was going on, but there's a demand and people want that. Other councils were telling people not to apply if they came in to apply for a brothel as a land use, not to, because it wouldn't get through council because of political opposition, but to apply for a massage parlour's licence. And people were misled that way. Lots of bad things happen in the planning stage. As far as the other regulators of work go, such as Fair Work and Safe Work New South Wales and all the regulators that people in other jobs rely on, they cover us as well, but they work on a complaints-based system. So to get something enforced, you have to go and make a complaint. And usually when you make a complaint, that complaint is against your employer, who's the brothel owner, and your details, name, address, whole of the complaint, goes to the brothel owner. And most sex workers don't want their real name and their address going to the brothel owner. Some brothel owners are nice, some brothel owners are nasty, just like any other business.
So I think he said a couple of really important things in that interview. The first one being that sex work in New South Wales is actually not fully decriminalized. It's not decriminalized in New Zealand either. There's actually nowhere in the world where there is pure decriminalization. There are still regulations, Cam said, that were left over from even when it was criminalized, mostly pertaining to street-based work. He also mentioned that decriminalization in New South Wales happened as a direct result of the extreme police corruption at that time. And I think this is just important to note because I know a lot of sex workers, especially from North America, really do see Decrim as this kind of utopia, and, may look at somewhere like New South Wales as being, this like utopic model, this utopic system. However, it was a struggle. Decriminalization came because of the extreme, struggle and corruption that was happening. And so it's not a perfect system. And we're going to go into that a little bit more.
I think, what I found really interesting about decriminalization in New South Wales specifically was that it came about because of the extreme police corruption. And obviously this is talked about, within sex worker circles so much, especially in North America. For example, that it's not illegal for a police officer to solicit you for sexual services and then arrest you afterwards, which I can only imagine how utterly humiliating and dehumanizing that would be for a worker. I mean, I think that's very much, rape. It's sex under false pretenses. And I think for whatever criticisms there are of decriminalization for not being a perfect system, that fact that the police no longer are in a position of power and position of blackmailing workers, it's a huge win.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What do you mean though? Because we were,
I mean that like these police officers can't blackmail workers anymore,
right?
In brothels and so on, and blackmail them and say, this is a disorderly house. You're arrested unless you suck my dick. You know?
And this is why decriminalization matters, because if we look at New South Wales, the history before decriminalization happened, the police were actually running brothels. They were the ones coercing sex workers into, like even giving free services and things like this. So it is a big deal for sex workers, 100%. And this is what we want to kind of stress in these episodes, is that, the legal situation of sex work matters to sex workers, to clients, so.
Like the state definitely shouldn't have this power of coercion.
Absolutely not. And even under a system, decriminalization, which is much improved, I think it's really important to remember the history, that it came about because the corruption was so bad and because, the police were operating in such an illegal, inappropriate way.
That being said, Decrim is not perfect. And
it's a work in progress.
Definitely. But I think that most of the problems with decriminalization are problems with government bureaucracy and capitalism, as well as, of course, with just societal stigma.
Huge.
And huge discrimination. When we spoke to Cam more about this, he mentioned Safe Work New South Wales, and this is a regulatory body that looks after like all jobs, all businesses. Employees, independent contractors, etc. And they work under a complaints basis. So they won't investigate a business unless there is a complaint, and the complaint has to be under the worker's name. And this is a specific hurdle in the sex industry because sex workers specifically like to work anonymously.
And let's talk about the fact that in New South Wales, working in a brothel is extremely common. Most sex workers actually start out working in a brothel before they go independent. We talked a little bit about this in our last episode because it is perceived to be safer. And there is kind of like a different perspective on brothel work than in North America. Like when I'm from, I think a lot of people would be, nervous to start working in a brothel in North America. However, for whatever reason, in the Southern Hemisphere, especially under Decrim, it is kind of more of a common practice to start out working in a brothel and then eventually go independent.
And I think it's also enshrined culturally for men to go to brothels in the way that men in America would go to a strip club. I think going to a brothel is not seen as, it doesn't have as much of a taint of the criminality about it. It's more of a laddish behavior.
And if you remember in our last episode, we were talking about some of the problems that we experienced in brothels and, kind of the power imbalance that, is weighted in favor of the brothel owner. And we're going to go into that.
I mean, I think the main hurdle is that workers in brothels are considered independent contractors. They're not employees. They don't have any work entitlements. You don't get sick leave. You don't get holiday pay. You don't have entitlements to meal breaks. You don't have any of the things that basically that are workers' rights. Supposedly the benefit of being an independent contractor is that you are able to negotiate individual contract. And, the point of this is supposedly that you might get a better deal out of this. However, if you're a worker, you almost never have more leverage, let alone a sex worker. You just don't have leverage against an employer. You have the option of working here or working elsewhere. That's it, really. You have to agree to the conditions or work elsewhere. And in brothels, they often have requirements that you are expected to adhere to, and you don't have any say or choice in that.
And if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else, which is a problem for sex workers and people working in a marginalized industry, because often people are sex workers because they don't have other options, or because it kind of presents itself as the best way and quickest way for a marginalized person to make money and be financially independent faster than in other industries. However,
not to mention, if you work in certain regional areas, there might only be one brothel in the entire town, or maybe two brothels, but you might be lucky if there's one in your town, and then what do you do?
And we experienced brothels having way too much power over workers, treating workers as if they are employees, even though technically they are not. And the problem is, these consent violations, these kind of inappropriate working conditions go unreported because Safe Work New South Wales functions on a complaints basis. And in order to make a complaint, as Cameron said, you have to give your full name, and then the brothel owner will become aware of your full name. And workers don't want to out themselves as sex workers for obvious reasons. There could be, perhaps they're not out to their family, and given the criminal history of a lot of brothels, it makes sense that people don't want to give their names to these kinds of institutions.
And if you were to pursue something in civil court as well, your name is associated with sex work on a public record.
Yeah. Not
something that most people want to do.
People want, yeah. And Cam did mention that it is a big priority for SWOP at the moment to introduce anonymity to this complaints-based process, which would be, in essence, a special regulation regarding sex work that maybe other forms of employment don't have.
Personally, I think, why don't all employees have this? Why can't all employees make a tip-off to an organization to investigate a complaint that they have? Why should you have to give your name?
It's true. It should be anonymous for everyone.
It should be anonymous for everyone. But Cam brought up a really interesting taxation case where there was a brothel owner who was suspected of tax fraud. He was suspected of not paying his proper taxes. And the tax office approached some workers in the brothel and asked them if they would be willing to make complaints. And they all said no. Obviously, they didn't want to. They didn't want to give their names, for one thing. And the tax office came up with a special solution for them where they were put behind a screen in court and they were able to testify anonymously against the brothel. And I certainly find it, I have pause that the workers were granted anonymity when it came to the government collecting taxes, but they are not granted anonymity when it comes to standing up for their rights.
Or protecting their safety.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is a huge problem. What we see, the regulation surrounding sex work is often not, protecting sex workers. So another thing that SWOP does is act as a liaison between sex workers and the police, who have not always had the greatest relationship. And as he mentioned, And he suggested that there should be a dedicated sex worker liaison in every police station, the same way there is one for other marginalized communities, such as LGBT people, for example. And he mentioned that right now there is only one officer for the entire New South Wales region. And this is not even really an official position. It's just that this specific officer kind of took on this title of being the sex work liaison. So that's obviously a problem.
I mean, it seems like a lot of what these organizations do is work as an intermediary between the worker and the institution, because there is just too much for an individual sex worker to have to navigate alone, in terms of you cannot go to just any police station and be expected to even be treated with respect, let alone to see justice for, if you've been harmed in any way. And I think that this obviously reflects that there's still so much institutional discrimination.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Even under decriminalization.
Yeah, so again, we want to reinforce the point that there actually is no true version of decriminalization in the world today. There are still regulations in place in New South Wales and New Zealand. For example, as Cam mentioned, that in New Zealand, condom use is mandatory. But we want to posit that what is important is that the right regulations are in place, and the ones that are in place right now are inappropriate. Sex workers need to be included in the process of creating regulation in order to properly identify what is necessary to protect us, keep us safe, and where workers' safety is the focus instead of, the public, protecting the public. Regulations that protect the sex workers rather than protect the public from sex workers, for example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for example, there's all sorts of rules in places where the sex industry works under a legalized model. For example, in Melbourne, where sex work is legal, it is not decriminalized. There are various regulations that, again, are put in place keeping in mind that that the public wants to be shielded from the sex industry. So, for example, there is the in-call rule in Melbourne. In Victoria, In Victoria, in-calls are illegal. That means that you cannot go to visit a sex worker except in a brothel. You cannot visit a sex worker in a hotel. You cannot visit them in their home. And really, largely, this rule is in place so as to prevent home-based sex workers bringing clients into middle-class neighborhoods. And this isn't safe. This isn't with the sex workers' safety in mind. It's really just like, we don't want them under our nose.
Yeah, basically, I think the crux of what we're saying here is that, if sex work, under decriminalization has its problems. If sex work is treated just like any other job, then the problems of stigma and outing oneself prevent workers from coming forward. However, when regulation is created around sex work, sex workers need to be included in that process.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a hard one because I think not everyone is in agreement of what sorts of regulations we want
even
to
sex
see.
workers.
Yeah. I think like one that's really contentious within the sex industry amongst workers is whether condom usage should be mandatory.
Yeah, and we've been discussing this for a while, and I remember when we were both still in the Southern Hemisphere, we were actually trying to come up with just a list of regulations that we personally would like to see in the sex industry. And I think maybe even I immediately said, mandatory condom use. And that comes from a place of, yes, privilege. I have the privilege of, being in a position where I can turn down work if the client is asking for bareback sex. I'm not in a financial position where I can't turn down work, or I have people who, I support. So, however, I am, frustrated at trying to prioritize my sexual health and safety, and to to lose work or to be kind of harassed by clients who are really pushing, especially in New South Wales, oh my God, to be harassed by clients who are continuously pushing for bareback sex and to offering me more money, or kind of slipping it in, like going through the booking process and then at the last moment slipping it in that they're looking for bareback sex. Like, this is very frustrating for me, because it feels like this client doesn't care about my sexual health and safety. They're assuming that I want the money more than I want to stay safe. Many clients are married, and that makes me, upset thinking about their marriage situation if they are, soliciting bareback sex from sex workers. And, the fact that a lot of sex workers aren't in a financial position to say no to a booking. So if a sex worker says no to bareback sex, and then somebody offers them more money, and they say yes after that, then this has this worries me in terms of sexual health and safety.
This is a really slippery slope, though, because it definitely, to me, harkens back to the Nordic model in thinking that you're purchasing someone's consent, and therefore it's not meaningful consent. I think it's really dangerous for us to talk about. It's an issue that challenges me a lot in terms of not judging other people's sexual practices, frankly, because I have always been in a privileged position where I have never needed to provide unprotected services in order to, eat or pay my rent, or feed an addiction. However, that's not a position that everybody is in, and I don't think anyone who is in any position should be penalized for offering these services. I don't think they should be judged, and I don't think that they should be penalized by the government like they are in New Zealand. It is illegal to offer unprotected services, and workers are fined. It does happen. In New South Wales, those regulations aren't in place. However, having said that, and like I said, it does challenge me to not be judgmental of others, but I realize those are my own issues to work on. I do believe that the customer in this position is in a position of power, and it only gives them, they're in a position of power over the worker, and I think that they should think about what they're asking for when they ask an escort to have unprotected sex with them.
Yeah, like personally, I see it as I'm very offended when people ask me for bareback sex, because they're asking me to take a risk and to potentially face a consequence that is, where I have more consequences to deal with the risks of bareback sex than the client does.
But I think, Susanna, the important thing to keep in mind is that to people outside the industry at all, to them having sex with strangers for money with protection is already them taking on a giant risk that they wouldn't be willing to take. This is the crux of the mandatory condom usage that I come back to, is that outside the sex industry, so many people would think what I do is so dangerous, so extreme, and absolutely something that they would not be willing to risk themselves.
Like, to be honest, I thought about this issue more after we talked about it, and I don't think that condom use should be mandatory, because I don't think that the state should ever impose laws over sex worker bodies. And until capitalism is burned to the ground, which is not happening anytime soon, we can't criminalize people. And that's what happens, by the way, under sex work regulations. When you fail to meet these regulations, you're criminalized again. So, I don't think that the state should be imposing laws on sex worker bodies, telling us what to do, because, there are so many people in positions where they cannot turn down the money. And so potentially that is, a risk for them, or potentially they've taken measures, maybe they're on PrEP, maybe, bareback sex is not such a big deal.
Maybe it's something that they engage in their private life, so it's not such a big deal, and it's not for me to judge that.
Yeah. So this is just an example of a more controversial issue that even among sex workers there is a debate. So, obviously we would want to be included in any kind of regulation surrounding bareback sex.
I mean, I think even having said I don't think philosophically that condom usage should be mandatory, I definitely notice, In New Zealand, where condom usage is mandatory, I've certainly found a lot of clients asked for it, but because of the law, I felt extremely, I mean, it's also illegal to give a blowjob without a condom. I found that it was very easy to work within, that framework, whereas in other places where condom usage is not mandatory, giving blowjobs without a condom is expected, and you will lose a lot of work if you don't offer it. So it is a tricky one.
Yeah, it has an effect on sex workers' lives for sure. Like, the law does have an effect. However, I'm personally of the opinion now that you shouldn't impose laws on sex worker bodies, but it's a contentious issue. Other less contentious issues that we came up with, regulations that we would like to see in the sex industry, and we hope that lawmakers consult us one day on this kind of stuff, is things like condoms and protective equipment provided by a brothel or otherwise. Like, if you are working under someone in the sex industry, it would be nice to have protective equipment provided. That, is what's supposed to be happening in New South Wales. However, brothels have found a loophole and they charge for them, and they say, well, they're provided, but you just have to pay for them. And this is unacceptable. Visas for foreign workers would be another one. Like, it would be great if, people could stay in a place legally, and if sex work was just regarded as a, legitimate, especially under Decrim, if it's regarded as a legitimate occupation.
If it's regarded as a legitimate occupation, there is no reason why foreign or workers who are non-citizens should be excluded from the industry. In New Zealand, there is no visa that allows you to work in the sex industry. This is a decriminalized place where the sex industry is decriminalized, yet there is no visa for any non-citizen worker to work in the sex industry. As a result, there are a lot of migrant sex workers who are not protected by the law, and this leads to incredible abuses. There are a lot of clients who know that non-citizen sex workers are far less likely to go to the police, and they are abusive and they're dangerous, and they target them. That's a fact.
And this is not something that people really out of the industry are aware of, but sex workers often need to travel to make money. Sometimes, there are seasons in sex work when, there's an off season, an on season. Sex workers often need to travel cities, they have clients in other cities. And this becomes really complicated when, you're immediately criminalized for working in another city even,
I mean, think of the two places. We're talking about New Zealand and we're talking about New South Wales. These are two colonial nations. These are nations that originally had, a ratio of far more men than there were women. There were a lot of entrepreneurial women who moved to these places 100 years ago and made bank, and in Australia, passports were not even instated until 1901. These are places that didn't even have borders until, recent history, and these are nations that are based on colonialization. I do not want to digress into my anti-border, radical politics, but as far as I'm concerned, if there are going to be visas, there is absolutely no reason why migrant workers should be prevented from working in the sex industry.
Sex industry benefits everyone, but that's a conversation for another time. We would like to see definitely the right to remain anonymous when making complaints, when speaking to the police, especially in court. We would also like to see anonymous bank accounts. That would be great,
The ability to receive money anonymously.
Because sex work is not treated like a legitimate occupation, sex workers are constantly, trying to, make appointments with clients who then either cancel at the last minute, who don't show up, behave in ways that they don't behave when going to the dentist or making a doctor's appointment. Sex workers often try to collect deposits to make sure that, if they make an effort to, for example, travel somewhere to see a client, or if they are receiving a client in a hotel, that they're not going to lose money if the client decides at the last minute that they don't want to show up. And they often do this when they know that there's zero consequences, because there's no recourse that the sex worker can take. However, if we're imagining that sex work is treated like a legitimate occupation, which is what we want, sex workers should be able to collect deposits in a way that doesn't jeopardize their safety.
And I think also the ability to set up anonymous business names and so on. All of these things, ways of your identity being hidden. Until stigma is over, we don't want to attach our real name to sex work.
We also would like to see increased sensitivity training for police, discrimination protection. It's really scary going to the police and outing yourself as a sex worker. I've had to call the police in Germany for a sex work related incident, and it wasn't, I'm a privileged worker, I'm a tax-paying citizen, I'm white. However, I was still treated with discrimination, and that was largely just due to the individual policeman's judgment call of the situation. I honestly believe that if I had a different policeman kind of come to my aid when I called, who had different life experience, different perspectives on sex work, then the situation would have gone differently. However, I did experience discrimination because the policeman that showed up was a macho German bro who didn't know anything about sex work. And actually, even based on the things he said, it was very obvious to me that he had no idea what was going on or how to appropriately respond to a sex worker who was in trouble,
Yeah, and I think touching on discrimination, workers need to have discrimination legislated, that you cannot be discriminated against in employment or housing or schooling or custody battles with, your husband to do with involvement in the sex industry, past or present. There is nothing put in place that says that you cannot discriminate against sex workers. You can discriminate against sex workers as much as you like. It is not illegal.
We also wanted to come up with some better conditions for brothels after we both had experience working in brothels in New South Wales. For me, it was my first time. If you want to go back and hear about our experience, you can listen to our previous episode.
I mean, a lot of what I've said in this is that, was my experience with working at the first brothel that I worked at when I first started. The first brothel that I started at when I started working in the sex industry 2 years ago in New Zealand. It was basically a very casual place that was run like a collective, very casually. You could come and go as you wanted. You could show up for 2 hours and leave. You could stay for 9 hours if you wanted to. You could even sleep on the couch if you felt like it. And it was very casual. It wasn't a high class place or anything like that, but I definitely felt very supported and safe, and just like I was hanging out with a bunch of girls and fucking some guys in another room for cash when required.
Yeah, which is pretty opposite experience than what we experienced in New South Wales.
There's no real reason why it can't be like that. It doesn't have to. The experience of working in a brothel is all about power and control.
Absolutely. I think, most positions where someone is managing sex workers tend to really easily be corrupt. Like most people who are managing sex workers, whether they are pimps, strip club managers, brothel managers, we might go into this more in another episode, but I think that corruption comes easily.
I think personally that corruption comes easily in like almost any type of like capitalism where there's like little agency
and regulation. Regulation.
For myself, when I worked in cafes, I remember just when I was at university, I was just treated like absolute shit, and I couldn't believe it. And working, and it's been, I don't know how many years, like more than close to 10 years since I worked in a cafe, and yet working in a brothel again, I had this feeling of being exploited, except it's a little bit more personal because it's like sexual exploitation.
It's true, yeah, definitely exploitation happens in most power positions, especially, bosses. However, unions and just kind of workers' rights have really changed that. And they just unfortunately don't apply in the same way to the sex industry because of, just like the reasons we've gone over, the lack of ability to come forward, to complain, the lack of knowledge of, I would imagine that Safe Work New South Wales doesn't have like a huge knowledge of how to deal with, the conditions within brothels, understanding the difference between sexual coercion and, just sex work that's part of the job.
Exactly. Like, I mean, refusing to see a client in a brothel is very different to refusing to serve a coffee to a customer.
Yes.
It's very intimate service, and I think it's necessary for that differentiation to be in the law.
Special regulations for sex work, which is something that we think should be a part of a decriminalization system.
So we came up with the right to refuse any client. I think
within a brothel.
That goes without saying. Flexible hours and no mandatory shifts and compulsory breaks, just like
any other job. Encouraging rather than dissuading girls to have boundaries, sex workers, to have boundaries. To have a management that supports staff, supports the decision of a sex worker to see a client or not see a client, supports a sex worker, if they're in an unsafe situation. This is all things that we...
I'll personally never forget when I first started in a brothel in Auckland, and I just had a bad feeling about a client, and I said to one of my co-workers, I don't want to see him. And she said to me, look, just don't do it. Just don't do it. And I said to the client, like, I'm sorry, I can't see you. And he was fine with it, and he left. And she was the manager, and she said to me, she was a manager and a worker. That makes a big difference. And she said to me, I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself. And she said she'd worked in parlors for years beforehand. And she said, if you'd worked in a parlor in the city, they would have forced you to see him. And I think that's the difference that it makes, is that where I worked in this brothel, it was very much run like a collective. We were all workers. Even the manager was another worker. She really was just an overseer of the business to make sure it ran smoothly.
Sex worker collectives, very interesting. Good thing.
Like the cottage industries that Cam was talking about. I mean, these small scale brothels where there's 2 or 3 or 4 workers working together, these are systems of brothel keeping that are very much, just stamped out under a legalized model, as opposed to, like these super regulated mega brothels, which are, in my experience, much more exploitative.
Yeah, we also came up with non-hierarchical, ideally co-working space.
How great would that be? You see these cafes all the time in like London or Berlin that are like co-working space. Why isn't there a co-working space for sex workers?
There was one in Montreal that was really great for a while, Indie Companion. I think it's changed slightly now, but I think it's a really good thing, when sex workers are working together. And of course, there's lots of politics to discuss, and it's a challenge. Co-working is a challenge, but I think it's a really great idea.
I mean, when I first came to Berlin, I was like, I want to start a co-working space for sex workers. And I quickly realized that this was a naive plan. The laws are not in place to support this. And it just is a bureaucratic nightmare, not to mention the difficulty of securing a building where the landlord is happy for it to be, deemed a brothel in a city like this where there is so much of a housing shortage.
To kind of sum up, I guess, is that, we experienced we witnessed a lot of exploitation under the decriminalization model in New South Wales. It's definitely not perfect.
And it's not perfect because stigma is weaponized against workers.
Exactly. And we asked Cam about whether he thinks there should be greater government regulation of sex work in New South Wales. And interestingly, he said no. He said that if the current regulations or model was properly enforced, keyword, properly enforced, that sex workers wouldn't actually need anything else. However, they're not being properly enforced, due to the lack of anonymity, due to stigma, etc. So this is just something, sex workers want decriminalization. However, decriminalization is not the final utopic destination for sex workers. Still, there's so much attention and work that needs to be done in specific, regulations that are sex work specific. Yeah.
So here are some final words from Cam about when he thinks sex worker rights will be secured in the state of New South Wales. He said this to us.
My partner says to me, like, not in your lifetime. And, I think he's probably right, but we still have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, because you were quite right. People don't know our situation. I'll give you 2 examples. Jackie's our policy person. We were invited to the Human Rights Awards dinner or lunch. They were standing up there making all fine speeches, and some wonderful people got Human Rights Awards. But they talked about, how all Australians have their human rights, apart from Indigenous Australians. And I'm going, what about fucking sex workers? We don't have our human rights. We don't have the right to work where we should want to, and I've read that. It's in the UN Charter. You have the right to work at your chosen occupation. We don't in most places. We don't have a lot of rights. And when we spoke to people from the Commission, they were sort of horrified that, you don't, They hadn't thought about us as being a marginalised community. They thought about us as being criminals.
So
yeah, that's a pretty depressing note to end on.
Yeah, but it just kind of goes to show, and honestly, we didn't really touch on the situation of street-based workers in New South Wales, but as Cam mentioned in, the first part of the interview that we shared, a lot of the regulation is around street-based workers and not in a way that supports them or secures their safety. So, yeah.
I think I just take from what Cam has said is that, we have to keep pushing and pushing. In other areas where sex work is still completely criminalised, they're pushing purely to get to the point where New South Wales is. But New South Wales still has a lot of work to do.
Definitely. And to end on a positive note, we do hope that lawmakers include sex workers in discussions around regulations and actually prioritize us and our lives and our safety, when creating regulations, what is legal and illegal. Because, bad laws affect sex workers' lives, and one bad law that isn't properly thought out can be the difference of a sex worker needing to act illegally in order to protect themselves, or to feed their children. So we hope that this becomes a priority in legislation, that actual sex workers are consulted like they are in most other legislations.
And I'll never forget seeing the poster at SWOP with a woman from the 90s in a protest, and she's holding a placard, and it says, "No bad whores, just bad laws." Yeah.
So thank you for listening. We hope that this hasn't been too dense and that you can kind of understand how decriminalization works and what work still needs to be done. And keep listening.
Yeah.
For more content about things that we're thinking about, as sex workers, as we navigate, our lives, legality, the issues that affect us.
If you have any questions for us about decriminalization, definitely feel free to talk to us on Twitter. We always welcome more discourse around, theory and rights. My Twitter handle is @CleoConstantine. That's @CleoConstantine. I'm shadow banned, so you have to type it in exactly.
And my Twitter handle is @Zuzu Gabrielli. It's ZUZUGABRIELLI, and we do welcome feedback of all kinds. Thank you for listening.